war are based on a variety of weapons, on variety of systems, and so on. And in this case, again, Ukraine is able to use drones to compensate for some of its disadvantages, as I mentioned, of shortage of manpower and other weapons, but it cannot be decisive. So Ukraine cannot use drones basically to be able to recapture territory or to defeat Russian forces and to go back to borders of 1999, 1991. This is almost zero chance of this. Overall, Ukraine still in retreat, and Russia makes still advances. If you look into total territory, and which is Russia already controls almost 20% of Ukrainian territory, and Russia has still also military advantage in terms of manpower, and Ukrainian government, Zelensky government now relies very heavily on force mobilization.
What if you turn hardship into greatness, anger into serenity? Everything changes. Make your life a masterpiece.
Have you ever wondered what freedom of speech means and what it actually means in terms of academia and why it is potentially in jeopardy right now, and really how we face and address this issue? This and much more now with Dr. Ivan Katchanovski, a scholar of Ukrainian history, and joins me now. Really, what a blessing to have you back and really discuss freedom of speech and academia and how it really relates to the Ukraine-Russia conflict.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. I think this is a very important issue to discuss, and also conflict in Ukraine is still a very important issue, and conflict because of Russia involvement, but also because of other issues which are related to academic freedom as well.
It is so important. So just give us a short update on Ukraine-Russia conflict and how it is evolving according to your perspective right now.
I think this war continues now for a very long time, and the outcome of this war was very clear from the start of this conflict, that Ukraine would suffer defeat, but not complete one, but partial defeat, which is what is likely now gonna happen. And Russia makes slow advances still, mostly in Donbass area in eastern Ukraine. And Ukraine was able to make some counteroffensive, small, to capture some, or to recapture some of the territory which was lost to Russia before. But overall, Ukraine still in retreat, and Russia makes still advances. If you look into total territory, and which is Russia already controls almost 20% of Ukrainian territory, and Russia has still also military advantage in terms of manpower, and Ukrainian government, Zelensky government now relies very heavily on force mobilization when men are captured basically on streets, on public locations, and even in their homes, and they are beaten, they are taken by force and sent almost immediately to frontline. So this is now war in which, again, Ukrainians have very little chance of winning this war, but it continues without any possibility of ending this war immediately. So it would still continue for some time because different actors in this conflict, specifically not interested in having a peace deal negotiated or accepted on terms which will be acceptable to different parties of this conflict. Russia wants to continue this war. They want to take back entire Donbass, which they now captured almost, I think, or close to 80% of Donbass territory. So, and they captured basically entire Luhansk region, and this is only part or small part of Donetsk region remaining for Russia to capture. But still, this is a very heavily fortified region, and there are now still fighting taking place in a few remaining cities under Ukrainian control in this region, Donetsk, which includes Konstantinivka, which is now basically surrounded by Russian forces, and or close to being surrounded by Russian forces. And there are also two cities of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, which are remaining under Ukrainian control. And in other areas, there is mixed fighting taking place, and still very heavy losses both on the Ukrainian side and Russian side. And the numbers which you can hear in the media, basically all these Western reports in Zelensky talk about that Ukraine now is winning this war, that Ukraine is able to kill like 30,000 Russian troops each month, which is again not based on any evidence. This is basically total propaganda, and this is very dangerous for Ukraine because this is kind of such false narrative is used to justify continuation of this war without any real prospect of winning this conflict. So Zelensky just justifies this war because it is beneficial for him to stay in power, using this war as a pretext. And for Western countries, specifically European Union countries, now they also want to continue this war as a proxy conflict. And the United States used to, again, to be kind of involved in negotiations to end this war after Trump was elected, but now the talks suspended because of the war in Iran and because of the failure to reach a peace deal. And the United States basically now become, again, taking secondary seat in this conflict. So I think this is a very difficult situation for Ukraine and Ukrainians, but not for Zelensky and for people who want to continue this war on different sides of this conflict.
How has the Iran conflict influenced what's happening on the ground in Ukraine?
So first effect was in terms of supplies of weapons from the United States, which United States used to provide Ukraine with missiles from Patriot air defense systems to shoot down Russian missiles, and now such supplies became in shortage. There is shortage of such supplies because of the war in Iran, exhausted a lot of U.S. Inventory of such missiles for Patriot air defense systems. So this was the issue which became very evident in recent strikes by Russia, which again was able to strike different parts of Kiev city, mostly industrial enterprises and military or industrial enterprises in Kiev. And Ukrainian air defense was not visible or was not very effective in shot down such missiles. And another factor is that Russia was able to benefit economically from this war in Iran because of the increasing price of oil. So Russia received a very significant boost in terms of money to continue this war. And for Ukraine and for Ukrainian backers in the West, specifically from the European Union, this war had a negative economic effect because of a rise in price of oil and gas, which is again very important for these countries. And another effect was that Zelensky tried to limit this ability of Russia to benefit from this war in Iran by striking oil refineries of Russia and other oil infrastructure, like in port infrastructure and other infrastructure involved in export of Russian oil or production of oil materials like gasoline and so on. And they were able to strike many such critical infrastructure, Russian critical infrastructure in oil sector, but it did not have a major decisive effect in this war because, again, Russia is able to rely on other enterprises far away from frontline, but also effects of this strikes by long-range drones were not as significant, even so as they were kind of shown by Zelensky and by his kind of propaganda heads who claim that this is again very effective strikes, but actually, if you look into reports by Western media and Western sources, Russia was able to repair and to restore its capacity to a significant extent after shortly after such strikes. So it did not lead to permanent destruction of this oil infrastructure by Russia, but had obviously negative effect. But it did not change the war pace or war outcome. So this is, I think, important issues. And another issue that I already mentioned, that peace deal became secondary now because of Trump involvement in Iran. War and peace talks now to end this war, but it might again, the conflict in Ukraine might again become more significant after a ceasefire would be announced by Trump, or some kind of interim peace deal with Iran would be announced by Trump. Then there's possibility that Trump again would go back and try to be again engaged in peace talks with Russia and Ukraine to end this war. But again, this is still very difficult, and new elections in the US in October or this fall would make it more difficult for Trump to do this, because expected defeat by Republicans in these elections.
How do you assess the situation of the technology that Ukraine has in terms of drones, and also its attacks on Moscow, and how does it influence the conflict as a whole?
I think Ukraine was able to rely on drones to a significant extent to try to counter or try to limit negative impact of shortage of manpower, of people, basically soldiers, to keep the front line. And drones were able to have a positive effect on such ability by the Ukrainian forces, and Ukraine was also able to strike targets inside of Russia, now in much bigger or longer distance compared to the past, using drones. And so this is obviously advantage to Ukraine to have such technology and to be able to use this technology to strike Russia. But again, this did not have any game-changing effect, similar to previous weapons which were kind of advertised that they would make change the outcome of this war and lead to defeat of Russia. This was in case of Patriot defense systems, F-16, HIMARS, and U.S. artillery and other kind of systems which were promised to change the outcome of this war, but they did not do this. And Leopard tanks by Germany and so on. So this is just another illustration that you cannot just win war by one weapon system. And Russia was also able to actually, and Russia still has advantage in drones because they use fiber optic drones to strike Ukrainian forces close to front line or on the front line, and they also rely on modified versions of Iranian Shahid drones to strike Ukrainian targets basically in entire Ukraine. So in contrast to Russia, which is only territory of Russia which is under potential strikes by Ukraine or actual strikes by Ukraine, which is limited in terms of its ability to strike such targets because of distance, and because of Russia is a much bigger country compared to Ukraine. Russia is able to strike basically all parts of Ukraine with their short-range drones, with their long-range drones, and such drones are much more bigger in terms of their ability to deliver explosives. So they have much bigger capacity to carry kind of such explosives, and they also such attacks are often also done in combination with missile strikes, which Russia has much bigger advantage compared to Ukraine. So in case of weapons, Russia still has a bigger advantage, and even if you take into consideration drones which are used by Ukraine, and such drones are not entirely produced by Ukraine, they are often collected or assembled basically with different parts which are acquired from China, for instance, or from European Union countries, and often are produced in these countries or assembled in these countries as well to avoid Russian strikes on drone facilities in Ukraine. And Ukraine also has some new technology in this case, but this was to a significant extent also supported by the West. For instance, former Google CEO or Google senior official or senior manager was involved in such a program to develop drones in Ukraine. And with Western support, with US support, and also United States intelligence provides crucial information for Ukrainian drones to strike Russian targets inside of Russia. So basically, it was admitted by US intelligence agencies in reports to Western media, I think specifically New York Times, that Ukraine receives information, specifically information from US intelligence, to identify targets potential targets for strikes by Ukrainian drones inside of Russia, including oil infrastructure. And often this is done not only just providing such information, but also giving guidance which parts of this oil infrastructure to strike and how to do this more effectively, how to avoid Russian air defense, to avoid any shutdown of such drones and so on. So this is still a very heavy reliance on the Western technology and intelligence to basically use drones in this war. And this was also hyped by the West to a large extent in the media and by politicians and so on as making, again, game changer, but it was not the case in the recent case with May 8 parade and steps by Zelensky to strike Russia during this parade, which commemorates victory over Nazi Germany, actually were based on previous attempt to strike Moscow, and Ukrainian drones were able to strike some areas and some infrastructure near Moscow, basically in suburbs or cities which are located in the same area as Moscow, but they were not able to penetrate with just a couple of exceptions, they were not able to penetrate very strong Russian defense systems in the Moscow, which again inside of Moscow. And for this reason, again, effectiveness of such strikes is quite limited compared to what Russia was able to do in Kyiv. So, as I mentioned recently, Russia was able to strike about 12 different enterprises and warehouses inside of Kyiv with their missiles and drones, and there were also some civilian apartments and a market, which was located just across from Artem missile plant, which were also struck and damaged during such strikes by Russia, but which is likely, again, a result of strikes of such military targets. But so they are able to do this, and they would likely to continue doing this to much bigger extent compared to what Ukraine is able to do in response compared to such strikes. And even today, there are reports that this night, right now, which is now it is after midnight in Ukraine, there are reports that Russia again is planning to have another massive strike, and the Russian government said, and Putin specifically said, that they're going to continue such strikes in Kyiv, which was not the main target of strikes of Russia before, but there were occasional strikes in Kyiv. But now they promise that they're going to do this much more frequently and to a bigger extent. So this would have also very significant impact, because Ukraine is not able to shut down such missiles and such drones with obviously with some exceptions, but again, this is not what is actually you can hear in this reports by Zelensky and Ukrainian military, that they shut down almost all missiles and all the drones, but this is not the case if you look into videos and other evidence of such strikes, including NASA satellites, which show fires taking place after such strikes in Kyiv and other locations in Ukraine.
Do you think it is helpful if Ukraine keeps striking Moscow, or at least tries to strike Moscow with drones?
I don't think this is going to be actually a fact that this is not going to change outcome of this war. Even if Ukraine would be able to strike Moscow and even targets inside of Moscow, this is not going to have decisive effect on the outcome of the war. So it will be mostly public relations effect, which is very crucial effect for Zelensky, because he likes to show these strikes. Each strike is shown on television, on social media, as just to present this view, basically, that Ukraine is able to defeat Russia, that Ukraine is winning this war, or that Ukraine is able to counter Russia and strike Moscow and other places inside of Russia. But this is obviously not the case. But this is kind of such narrative which is used mostly for public relations purposes, because Russia was able to strike Ukrainian territory, and including Kyiv, for a long time, basically since the start of this invasion, this war in February of 2022. But this did not lead to capitulation of Ukraine. This did not lead to, again, to defeat of Ukraine. Ukraine did not accept this as a defeat, so this did not limit capacity of Ukraine to continue this war in terms of weapons or in terms of other considerations. So in this case, I think again would be not a decisive, Ukrainian strikes will not be decisive compared to a much bigger effect which Russia had on using such capacity to strike Ukrainian targets. And another issue which is also very important, because Russia has the ability to escalate in such strikes. So if Ukraine would even able to strike some infrastructure inside of Moscow, as it done already in case of other regions of Russia, it would be, again, it would lead to a much higher escalation from the Russian side. And one escalation, which was already shown in the past, would be for Russia to strike critical energy infrastructure of Ukraine, specifically power stations in Ukraine and power substations in Ukraine, which could lead during next winter, or even during summer, when you have a peak in consumption of again electricity, can lead again to negative effect on Ukraine and Ukrainian population, because Russia has a capacity again to strike such electricity infrastructure and power stations, which can lead to shortages of electricity, which were very evident during last winter, and this can happen again. So Russia has such ability to escalate this conflict, and again even to bigger extent, because they do not yet target any nuclear power stations or substations which directly lead to nuclear power stations. So this is again what can have also negative effect if Russia would decide to completely shut down basically almost all production of electricity and distribution of electricity, specifically in regions which are close to front line, but also in the western regions of Ukraine, as Russia was able to do during the winter, when there were massive shortages of electricity and people were without power for a long time, and this is again not only related to electricity but also to water, ability to have water, because water supplies rely on electricity as well, and also ability to have heating, because heating also needs electricity, and a lot of Ukrainians have basically electric power used also for heating their homes and so on. And this is also would be a negative effect if the conflict would continue in such a case.
What's your response to the argument that if Russia further escalates the conflict, in other words, in response to these strikes, it is a sign of weakness? In other words, Russia basically is losing the war. That's something that you hear time and again when you watch Western media.
I think the Western media just is not a reliable source, which I show you in my book, based on evidence, based on research, based on actual data. And in my book, Russia-Ukraine War and its Origins, I actually present narratives and propaganda narratives by Ukrainian media, by Ukrainian government, by Russian government in media, and by Western governments in media, and show that these narratives, again, by all the governments, by all the media, they are based to a large extent on false information, disinformation, on propaganda, and I rely on actual data, on reliable data, which can be used to determine actually what happened and what kind of effect we would have in this case. So in the case of the war in Ukraine, again, Western narrative, which is used to justify this war, which is not winnable for Ukraine, is to claim that Ukraine is able to defeat Russia, or that Ukraine is stalling Russian advances, that Ukraine is able to turn tide of this war, and this is now became evident in the last few months when Russian advance slowed down in Ukraine, and Ukraine was able to capture some territory again, which was captured before by Russia. And so there were genuine advances by Ukrainian military in areas like Zaporizhia region or Dnipropetrovsk region. But again, overall tendency of this war, overall, Russia still able to capture more territory compared to Ukraine. And just capturing territory is not the goal. Again, not just one metric of this, or not just a goal of Russia per se, because a Russian goal would be most important goal for them is to capture Donbass. And also the secondary goal would be to capture more territory of Kherson and Zaporizhia region of Ukraine, which were annexed by Russia and occupied most of the territory occupied by Russia already. But this war is also war of attrition. And each day of this war leads to casualties of Ukrainian forces and also Russian forces. But if you look into evidence which relies on individual soldiers who are identified by name and who is shown to have been killed in this war or missing in action in this war, so casualties of Russian forces and Ukrainian forces, and if you check into add casualties of separatist forces from Donbass, which are now incorporated into Russian forces. So they are approximately similar in terms of magnitude. So now we can say that more than 200 Russian and separatist forces members were killed based on individual names of soldiers who were identified as killed or missing in action. And we can also say that more than 200,000 Ukrainian forces members were killed or missing in action, which presumably also killed if you subtract Ukrainian forces who are regarded as prisoners of war now. So this is again for Russia, because Russia has much bigger population compared to Ukraine, 4 times bigger population, and Russia relies on volunteers who are paid a large amount of money, and also relied in the past on prisoners who were given basically conditional release if they will join fighting for Russia. So Russia was able to, again, to still continue this war, and it would be able to continue this war for a long time because of this advantage of manpower. And Russia can still again announce partial mobilization in case if this will be needed, or even complete mobilization as was done by Ukraine already. But Ukrainian ability to mobilize people now is much more limited because of much smaller population and because of a very big number of Ukrainians who are deserted or who try to avoid being adopted into Ukrainian forces. So you have more than 1 million, I think a few million of Ukrainian men who are hiding in Ukraine in their houses. They are afraid to exit their kind of houses. They stay in their houses. They don't work, or they are kind of they have food from again by their relatives, supply relatives and so on, because they are afraid of being captured on the street or any public location like shop or any other location, grocery store and so on, by press gangs, and recruited basically and by force sent immediately to frontline where they can be killed or wounded. And this is again leads also to many Ukrainians who are deserters, who desert Ukrainian forces, and according to latest data, there were more than 200 such deserters in Ukrainian forces. And for this reason, because of very large number of deserters from Ukrainian side, these numbers were stopped to be published. So now they are not published, but in the last published data, in the fall of last year, there were close to 20,000 Ukrainian men who fled or deserted their forces each month. And this was on increasing tendency. So this is, I think, major problem. And Ukraine is not able to do this, even relying on such kind of force, basically to send people by force and without any training, without people who even sick and not able to fight. They are sent to frontline, and many of them are killed and wounded. And I read each day in my native Volyn region reports about these people who are killed and wounded, killed, or again, people who were previously identified as missing in action, who now identified as killed after exchanges of bodies from Russia. And this is, I think, a very difficult situation for this reason.
So when you look in the future, do you think like the war will substantially change and will be more fucked by drones, including for Russian forces that they will use more drones as well as the Ukrainians?
I think the number of drones increasing by both Russia and Ukraine. They use this technology to much greater extent. So this tendency is likely to continue unless there would be some new solution to drones found. And there are such attempts to use counter drones or to have some new techniques to deal with drones, to shoot down and so on. But again, it's difficult to know what would be outcome of this technology. So it's not easy to predict the war in the first place because it can something unexpected can happen, or you cannot possibly to envision everything. And in case of drones, again, just reliance on one weapon system is not a good kind of way to again to predict war outcome, because war are based on a variety of weapons, on variety of systems and so on. And in this case, again, Ukraine is able to use drones to compensate for some of its disadvantages, as I mentioned, of shortage of manpower and other weapons, but it cannot be decisive. So Ukraine cannot use drones basically to be able to recapture territory or to defeat Russian forces and to go back to borders of 1991. This is almost zero chance of this. And even using drones and so on, and Russia is able also to rely on drones. They were able to use fiber optic drones, and they still develop and expand their ability to use Shahid drones, which now produce in different modifications. They can fly faster. They can use also cameras and other kind of technology to avoid Ukrainian air defenses. So Russia also modernizes such technology and drone technology. So it's not a one-way street. And contrary to what you can often hear in the media, and there are some other issues like supplies of drones and so on. And Russia also threatened to maybe attack some of factories which produce drones or assembled drones, which are located on territory of European Union countries like Czech Republic or Poland or Germany and so on, and United Kingdom, because this is kind of a major issue. And a major advantage for you can be able to use safe haven basically to assemble such drones and then only to ship them to Ukraine with again, which is not easy to detect by Russia, and Russia can again threaten to hit such sites of drone production in other countries which are destined for Ukraine. So this is again can lead to escalation of this conflict if Russia would do this. And also Russia also threatened to have responses to after drone attacks, recent drone attacks on oil and infrastructure of Russia in Leningrad region and other regions of Russia, after which or during which some of the drones fell in the Baltic states, on territory of the Baltic states and Finland. So this led to accusation by Russia that Ukraine was using airspace from these countries, Baltic states and Finland, to strike Russian targets. And so Russia threatened retaliation against these countries, which can again have very significant escalation because Finland, now a member of NATO, and Baltic states are members of NATO. And just today or this night, at night there was a Russian strike on a southern port city on Danube, Ukrainian port city on Danube, and one of the drones hit apartment in Romania, in neighboring city of Romania, which led to again to escalation of this conflict. And now this I gave interview also to Portuguese media about this drone strike, and just this drone which strike Romanian apartment was used basically again as to invoke NATO Article 4 and to have a response from NATO countries and so on. But now President of Romania stated that this drone likely hit Romanian apartment after it was hit by Ukrainian air defense and changed its flight path. So this is again was even clear before, because if you look into all evidence of Russian and Ukrainian strikes by missiles and by drones, with very few exceptions, again, they tend, long-term strikes, they tend to strike in absolute majority of cases targets which are military infrastructure or military targets, or they are dual use infrastructure, like oil and gas infrastructure or electricity infrastructure and so on, or some bridges and so on. But with a few exceptions, there were also strikes by Ukraine of dormitory in Luhansk region, which led to, I think, 21 people killed, mostly young girls, women. This was a college dormitory, and they were struck by Ukrainian strikes, and this led to Russia to saying this was deliberate strike against civilian targets. But this is not very likely this was the case. It most likely this is a mistake which has happened also on Russian side when they hit during drone strikes or missile strikes, which use hundreds of drones and missiles, or even close to 1,000 drones and missiles in total. They you have, if you look into such outcomes, such strikes by Russia, for instance, you see that if you have just few apartment hit, and typically civilian casualties are small, like few civilians are killed, and but there are also casualties which can be significant, as in case of recent Russian strike of apartment building in Kiev, when there were also more than a dozen civilians killed. So there were similar other strikes as well, but they are most likely by mistake, because number of civilians killed by both Russia and Ukraine is small compared to all modern conflicts. If you took into account other wars, this is one of the wars in which number of civilians killed is much smaller compared to typical number of civilians. If you compare this as a ratio, not a total number, but as a ratio, but also total number, but more specifically as a ratio between military casualties, which I already mentioned, total would be more than 400 civilian military members of military, both Russian and Ukrainian, and separatists killed or missing in action and presumed to be killed, compared to about 20,000 total number of civilians which were killed in this war, most of them on Ukrainian controlled territory, about 15,000, and about 5,000 on territory which was annexed by Russia in Ukraine, and also some few hundred on territory of Russia, Russian Federation. So the total number of civilians is civilian casualties is, for instance, much smaller compared to war in Bosnia, or war in Iraq, or war in Syria, and other major modern conflicts which took place in different countries, and ratio is also much smaller. So in this case, all these narratives basically blaming, saying that the systematic targeting of civilians is not based on any evidence, but there are some cases like of drones used against civilian targets deliberately, for instance in Kherson city, and also on some cases when you can clearly see that civilians were hit, and it was very evident because there was no sign of military presence and so on, and they were in the open without, again, and such drones were also used by Ukrainian forces, but this is exception compared to overall pattern, which is shows that there is no deliberate targeting of civilians by both Russia and also by Ukraine, and claims to the contrary are just propaganda and disinformation, just used specifically to for their advantage by governments of these countries, but also by Western countries and the media to just justify their involvement in this war and continuation of this war, which can lead to more casualties actually among Ukrainians and also specifically, but also among military. And the number of these casualties is classified often or limited in terms of ability to learn about them, or coverage is very limited. They often focus only on Russian casualties and inflate such casualties, and do not talk about Ukrainian casualties at all, military casualties, and if they talk about only civilian casualties, and also inflate such a number of casualties by Russian side and by civilians. This is done for propaganda and purposes. Basically, this is not based on evidence. And as a scholar, it's necessary to look into evidence and how this is misused by politicians, by the media, which often just repeats what politicians say without actually looking into specific evidence.
Yeah, this is a huge problem because I see it in the Iran conflict as well. When I talk to some people, they say 20% of the population supports the regime. On the other hand, if I talk to others, they say precisely the opposite. So it's really hard to really discern what's actually true. And so that's a really good point. So we will wrap this up, and then we will really go and dive into the specific topic why we are really here today is freedom of speech, specifically how it relates to Ukraine-Russia conflict. But before we go into this, what's your prediction? How long can this conflict drag on?
I think this is difficult to predict again because wars are predicted by often again in terms of the exact duration. But I think this also depends on a variety of factors like United States involvement, European Union involvement, and also if Zelensky would remain in power, and if there are any changes by Russia and so on, if any changes in weapon supplies and so on. But I think this war cannot last now for years. And there were reports that in Economist that Zelensky said that he wants to continue this war or prepare for this war to continue for 2 or 3 years, basically after new presidential elections in the US, which means even longer because he hopes to get support from Democrats after defeat of Donald Trump in presidential elections or his success in presidential elections in the US. And there is also kind of another claims that this war can end sooner, and Putin just claims that he expects this war to end sooner, or that there will be soon end to this war because he claims that again that Ukraine is being defeated on the front, again on the battlefield, which is not the case. Again, there are slow advances, but there is no kind of yet evidence that Ukraine is is facing imminent defeat any kind of months, and this happen very soon. So this again war might continue. I think until next year, this is a possibility, but it can end again by the end of this year if there will be again, unless there will be some other event which did not took place, because I expected that Donald Trump would end this war because he has leverage over Ukraine, over Zelensky, and he would basically try to end this war by using this leverage. But there was no such leverage used by Trump. He was involved in these negotiations, but he did not use any leverage, with some exceptions. So in this case, it would be, again, if Donald Trump wanted to end this war, there is such possibility to end this even sooner. But otherwise, this war would continue maybe until next year. But it cannot be very long because Ukraine faces a possibility that the longer war would continue, if it would continue for more than a year and so on, in such case Ukraine can suffer total defeat, compared to more realistic possibility of accepting a partial defeat as the outcome of this war, because again this small advances by Russia and war attrition can gradually lead to collapse of Ukrainian front line and not ability to have sufficient manpower and weapons to counter Russian strikes. So this can lead to much faster collapse of Ukrainian forces compared to what these predictions that they take into account only Russian small advances. But it's not only such advances. If you look into cumulative picture of this war, Ukraine is not able to fight for this war for a long time on its own. And even without Western support, without provision of weapons by the West, provision of intelligence by the West, provision involvement in training and so on by the Western countries, since the start of this war, Ukraine could have been defeated already in spring of 2022. So this was manifested by peace talks in Istanbul when Zelensky wanted to reach peace agreement. And so this meant that he realized that there would be no possibility to defeat Russia at the time and was ready to sign agreement and end this war. But because of visit from Boris Johnson and because of Western countries, other Western countries' pressure, like including Biden administration, this war continues, because Zelensky was told to continue this war and that he would be supported by the West with weapons and so on. So for this reason, this is the major reason why Ukraine was able to continue this war for such a long time. because of Western weapons, because of Western intelligence information, because of Western financial support, which is very crucial, because you can rely on Western money to pay salaries to government employees, to university teachers, to public sector employees and other and military, so it's not able to do this on its own, and it also relies on other kind of support, like natural gas support and energy support, and in addition to weapons. So this means again, if Western support would end, or it would be much more limited. If Trump would end intelligence support to Ukraine, this can lead to end of this war much faster. And if this support would expand, for instance, if United States elections would lead to defeat of Republicans, which is very likely in the Congress of in this fall, this can lead to a situation when there will be again a resumption of significant financial support from the United States and even weapons, if Congress would decide to make such support, and Donald Trump would agree with this. So this can lead to again to much longer continuation of this war, because you cannot be able to continue this war for a longer time. So it's not easy to predict, but again, in any case, our outcome is very clear. It's already, so there will be no decisive change unless something happens, which is again, kind of black swan event, but it's not. There's no such kind of possibility to predict everything. But if you look into such possibility of any radical event taking place, this is very unlikely to happen. So you cannot just bet on such kind of events, which can have also negative impact on Ukrainian ability to continue this war. So I think this is kind of complex issue, but the longer war continues, there will be more negative consequences to Ukraine, and more people in Ukraine will be killed, but also civilians as well, and but mostly military casualties, and this would lead to devastation of Ukrainian economy and energy sector and infrastructure without any possibility of defeating Russia. So this war continues now, basically without any possibility of changing this war or making a peace agreement. And if even the situation with Iran shows that if countries like United States recognizes that US recognizes that it's not able to defeat Iran, so the outcome is to reach a peace agreement in this case. So this is kind of natural for countries to do this, but in case of Ukraine, this is done very differently, and even peaceful resolution of this conflict was regarded as not a possibility, was dismissed, and now it's still kind of basically rejected as capitulation. Even so, this is not the case. You can still have a peace deal on terms which will be much better compared to what can happen in the future.
Now let's see it to your open letter in support of academic freedom. Why do you think it is necessary to write this open letter in support of academic freedom, and how does it relate to Ukraine-Russia conflict?
This letter was written in response to denunciation, which was initiated by Andreas Umland and Shekhovtsov, who are actually kind of just activists and info warriors who denounced my book, The Russia-Ukraine War and Its Origins, and initiated such a letter, collective letter, denouncing me and my book, which I published in major academic Western press, and which examines the war in Ukraine from academic perspective as a scholar, because they did this for political reason. They wanted to censor my book. Basically, they wanted to kind of censor me, again, cancel me, attack my job, my funding of my research, and other issues, also to basically ban my book in Ukraine and so on. This was their kind of method of operation, which is contrary to what academics supposed to do. In academia, you do not rely on kind of collective denunciations. You don't use such methods which are clear political tools, which are similar to what was taking place in Russia, for instance, not in Russia, in Soviet Union, during Stalin times, or in Soviet Union times, when there was a collective denunciation of Pasternak for his novel Dr. Zhivago, because it was considered to be, again, ideologically subversive and so on, and he was kind of condemned on this collective letters and collective denunciation for writing this book and publishing this book in the West. Even so, it received Nobel Prize in literature. So there is a kind of similar kind of attempt to censor academic research and to go and to attack me as a Ukrainian scholar for writing my book based on topic and based on evidence. And this attack is politically motivated. And again, there were people who joined this attack, which is also very clear that this is kind of this is not based on any kind of any actual reasons. This is based on political reasons, and they falsely claimed that my book is so popular because it is this hidden involvement of Elon Musk in kind of in some kind of making people to view my book and download my book and read my book. Even so, there is no such evidence whatsoever. There is no such involvement of Elon Musk in kind of in making my book to be read basically by other people, kind of covertly and so on. This is total conspiracy theory with false charges, false claims, because my books are very popular and my studies are very popular. And I mentioned before that my studies, academic studies, publications receive already more than 2 million views and downloads on different websites, including my academic websites and websites of publishers. Before I published my current book about the Russian-Ukraine war and its origins, and my book about the Maidan massacre in Ukraine already has close to 500,000 views and downloads, which is published by the same academic press, major Western academic press, as open access book. So the claim that this is view, that this is again, that my views of my book and downloads of my book about the Russia-Ukraine war and its origins, which were in April of 2000 of this year, which was kind of claiming this collective denunciation to be unusual or very high and supported by Elon Musk because they received 248,000 is totally false and fake, because again my studies are already much bigger impact. My other studies have much bigger impact and number of views and downloads. This is was deliberate fake promoted by Umland, who is now kind of affiliated with a variety of think tanks in Ukraine and Sweden, and who is openly now supports and quotes neo-Nazi leader of Azov for near to total mobilization. Umland also claims that Russia kind of blew up Nord Stream, that all the videos of mobilization in Ukraine by force are Russian propaganda. So he just repeats everything which is repeated by the government of Ukraine. So basically he's not a scholar. He did not publish any book himself on this conflict, so he's not expert, but he initiated this denunciation for political reasons. And he was joined by Shekhovtsov, who was leader of a Russian organization in Crimea, which was led by Dugin, this philosopher who is again kind of famous in the West for his views. Russian nationalist views, and this is Shekhovtsov was leading demonstrations against NATO and heading this organization in Crimea before he became before he decided to go in and get his PhD and become again associated with Umland. So this is total false claims, and they also claim that this my book tried to link my book to Russian propaganda and so on, because they said that my book stated that Russian imperialism had secondary impact on this war, in Russian invasion, and secondary factor in this conflict, but that this conflict is escalation of previous conflicts in Ukraine, which go back to the Maidan massacre. So they said that this is again, they said this is scholars should not read this. They should not read about any internal conflicts in Ukraine, about war in Donbass, about Crimea and other issues, because they said only basically the only one explanation which is correct is that Russia invaded Ukraine for no reason, because Russia wanted to do this for hundreds of years, and this is like Russian imperialism, and this is only explanation which academics should follow, which is totally kind of contrary to how academia works. And there are many other researchers who already published other books in which they examine the role of the United States in this conflict, the role of the role of NATO expansion and so on, which I also examine in my book. So I examine different factors of which in addition to Russian imperialism, I also basically my book found that this war was escalation basically by Russia, dramatic escalation by Russia of the conflicts in Ukraine, which go back to Maidan massacre, which was conducted with by elements of Maidan opposition and was de facto supported by the West to overthrow the Ukrainian government, which was pro-Russian government at the time, and led to conflicts in Russian annexation of Crimea, and also civil war and Russian interventions in Donbass, and these conflicts were escalated by Russia, and Russia also escalated conflict between Russia and the West, which go back to conflicts in Ukraine, but also to expansion of NATO, which Russia also inflated the role of this factor because there was no immediate prospect of Ukraine becoming a NATO member, but Ukraine was used also by de facto as a NATO member by the West because without any protection, because Ukraine became a client state according to my research of the United States after Maidan massacre. So this is kind of a response, collective response to this denunciation of academic research, my book, and an attempt to basically to install some kind of only one correct point of view by people who are not experts in this conflict, who do not publish their own books, by try to use kind of researchers in Ukraine in different fields and basically say what researchers like scholars like me are supposed to write about this war. And this is again and the collective letter in defense of academic freedom, and my defense already received signatures of more than 200 people in 35 countries of the world, including Canada. Many Canadians signed this letter, and this letter was also signed by more than 100 academics or scholars from different countries, from more than 2,000 countries in the world, including many scholars from Canada, including very, again, famous researchers specializing in conflicts and politics of Ukraine and Russia and other countries in this region. So this is, again, I think a very important statement, testament to importance of academic freedom, especially dealing with such issues which are politically controversial and very difficult to research. And myself, I knew that this is area which is difficult to research and to publish, but I think this is important for me to publish based on evidence, and such a letter, which is still available to be signed online. It will be published soon. But I think this is, a very important response and affirmation of need to have academic freedom, especially in the West, because in Ukraine there's no such freedom of academic freedom. Ukraine is not democracy, and it's not possible for me as a Ukrainian scholar even to write anything like what I wrote and published in the Western academia in Ukraine, because this would lead kind of to immediate dismissal, for instance, or even criminal charges, kind of which is very typical in Ukraine now. There is no freedom, academic freedom in Ukraine, but in the West, it is also important to preserve academic freedom, and also to affirm academic freedom in Ukraine, which is now also under even bigger attack compared to what situation is in the West.
What ideas or facts are academics afraid to investigate today?
I think one of the major examples of this, what academics are afraid to investigate, and which was demonstrated by this collective denunciation of my book, was the Maidan massacre. This is one example, and also role of other kind of issues, related topics like far-right involvement in this conflict in Ukraine, including open neo-Nazis involvement, Nazi collaboration in Ukraine, who are celebrated by Zelensky government, and other issues which are regarded as again, politically difficult to examine, like, for instance, Nord Stream explosions and sabotage, and other issues like Ukrainian casualties, military casualties, and everything which is politically inconvenient. So in this collective denunciation, they omitted any reference to my Maidan massacre book, even so. kind of previously, I was also denounced for writing about Maidan massacre, but now they say this is not important, basically. And this is the reason also very clear evidence that they cannot challenge my research. They cannot challenge my evidence. So they say, basically, we should not look into this issue. We should not investigate. So researchers and scholars should not look into any issue about Maidan massacre. It's totally irrelevant. It's totally unimportant, and so on. Even so, this is a crucial issue for the start of this conflict. And even I cite in my book statement by European Union President Ursula von der Leyen, who said that basically this conflict started with Maidan massacre, which took place. So this is kind of one example of this. Another issue is neo-Nazis and far right in Ukraine, which is also very important. But many researchers are afraid to talk about this issue. And I know, personally, I know many scholars who support me or talk about these issues, about Maidan massacre, who talk about this neo-Nazis in Ukraine and so on. But publicly, they are afraid to say this publicly because this would have negative impact on them, and they are afraid to do this in public, including social media or in the media. When I gave interview to CBC about neo-Nazi Azov shortly after the Russian invasion in 2022, I was told basically to be very careful to talking about Azov. Even so, I said everything what I found based on my research, and I did not do any censorship myself. But I was told by before that several researchers of far right in Ukraine were refused to give interview on this topic because they were afraid to talk about this issue. So if you have situation when neo-Nazis in Ukraine, open neo-Nazis in Ukraine, you cannot discuss this. This is quite also unbelievable, because now you have people like kind of Shekhovtsov and Umland, who used to be researchers of far right. Now they promote all these narratives that there are no neo-Nazis in Ukraine, that they are become depoliticized. They support them even now openly. Shekhovtsov and Umland, they support neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and they consider this is to be, again, now if you talk about this issue as a researcher, they regard this as a problem, and that's why they attack anybody who does this, including me or other scholars like Marta Havrishko or Volodymyr Lishchenko, who are also Ukrainian scholars, but also talk about far right and including open neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And even recently there was the rebellion of Nazi collaborators in Ukraine. And Zelensky personally participated in this. People who were involved in mass murder of Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians during World War II, who collaborated with Nazi Germany, who established the police and SS Galicia division, the same division whose veteran was given standing ovation by Zelensky and by the Ukrainian parliament. So now Zelensky, after his silence about his standing ovation to this veteran of this Nazi SS division in Ukrainian parliament, he openly declared that he called the leader of far right organization, fascist OUN organization, Melnik, Andrei Melnik, whose organization was involved in creation of this SS Galicia division with Nazis. He called this OUN fascist leader as a Ukrainian hero, and he paid him homage. During his rebellion, he said this is basically that Ukraine is now what this person deemed to be, and this is kind of quite unbelievable to see this taking place. And many scholars who research far right in Ukraine, and Nazi collaborators in Ukraine, Western scholars who have tenure in the West, they were afraid to say anything publicly. I don't see any reaction from them. Even so, they know that this is like a Nazi collaborator who was involved in this, and his organization was involved in mass murder of Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians, but they are afraid to do this, to say publicly anything, because of this kind of situation. So you have kind of now basically a censorship and self-censorship by many scholars who are afraid to talk about these issues. But for me, this is not a reason to censor myself, or because as a Ukrainian, as a scholar, I know this is important issues, and just and if you don't talk about them, this would have much more negative impact. And one example of this, that far right in Ukraine, in Maidan massacre in Ukraine, which took place in 2014, I was talking about this. I was publishing academic studies about this, because one of the reasons for this is to avoid this escalation and potential of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has happened. I I wrote this in my media interviews. I wrote this in my media publications that it is important to resolve the Maidan massacre and in the moment of a right in this mass murder, in order specifically to avoid potentially Russian invasion of Ukraine and escalation of this conflict to war between Russia and Ukraine, which has now happened. And this is kind of also important to understand and how to resolve this conflict and other reasons for this conflict. That's why I regard this as a duty of academics, not to rely on any censorship, not to do any self-censorship, but write about these topics, because there is nobody else who do this in the media. Media became totally kind of based on just repeating all the narratives from politicians and not based on evidence. And politicians in the West and other countries basically just follow what they want to hear, and for political reasons, and not based on evidence.
Are we better here in the West, and do we try to avoid consensus over evidence?
Yes, I think there is no kind of now evidence, which is what research is supposed to do. So you have evidence-based medicine. So if people go to have a doctor visit, they rely on evidence. They rely on like tests, medical tests, on like blood tests and other type of evidence, which is how examination and so on by experts, by doctors in the area of their kind of specialty. And this is an example of importance of evidence based on research. The same applies to trials. Judiciary, basically, they also look into evidence, specific evidence like witness testimonies and like forensic evidence and so on. And researchers in social sciences, including conflict in Ukraine, need to do the same. Basically, this is what researchers are supposed to do, what scholars are supposed to do, is to rely on evidence. And media are supposed to do this as well. I teach also courses about research methods and show how this can be done, how evidence can be collected, analyzed using different methods and so on. But now, a lot of media, basically most media abandon this duty, and they're not looking to evidence, they look into politics and repeat what just politicians say without any changes, just any determination if this is correct or not, if this is supported by evidence or not. And many researchers also do this kind of just using basically everything which was said told by the media, by politicians. They just repeat everything what they hear without any looking to if this is correct or what the evidence tell us. So they just repeat everything about the war in Ukraine, just looking what politicians say, what's happening, and which is not actually based on actual evidence. And one example of this was when there was a visit and a presentation and talk by Foreign Minister of Canada at the University of Ottawa for the anniversary of Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. So she gave such a talk at the University of Ottawa, which I attended in February of this year. And she basically was saying that all this talk that Ukraine is winning this war, that the Russian casualties are now about 30,000 Russians killed each month, which is again totally kind of based without any evidence. This is no such evidence to support this. And such casualties are impossible, because this would mean if you check into such number of casualties, Russian forces would be already kind of killed and wounded based on such casualties numbers, which is physically impossible. And it has not winning the war, which I already mentioned. But she was saying this in the university, and so there were some professors who, again, supposed to based on rely on evidence, but they were kind of checking this as a face value and just saying this is basically as a case without any challenging, without any challenges, without any need for any verification. So this is just one example of this, which is also very important, because politicians, if they have kind of, if they are not challenged, if they are able to kind of promote this kind of such narratives, actually not relying on the evidence, they rely on wishful thinking, they rely on political considerations, but researchers need to do opposite and rely on evidence. But a lot of scholars now are afraid to look into evidence. They say anything evidence. Basically, their tactic is also what is done by propaganda. So if anything is not consistent with, if something is not consistent with evidence, for instance, Maidan massacre, or that Ukraine is winning the war, their claim is not consistent with evidence. They say this is like Russian disinformation, Russian propaganda. So everything which is not consistent with their own propaganda, with their own narrative, is immediately dismissed as Russian propaganda, as Russian evidence, as Russian disinformation, no matter what the evidence tells us. But again, and if the same, you have people who also follow Russian propaganda, disinformation, take this at face value without looking into evidence, which I already mentioned, for instance, that Ukraine is Nazi country, again, and other false names promoted by Russia. So this is actually kind of duty of scholars to rely on evidence and examine evidence no matter what will be the case. And what I did in my study, my book, open access book about the Russia-Ukraine war, its origins, and also in my book about the Maidan massacre, I look into evidence, primary evidence. I look into testimonies of witnesses, testimonies of people who were involved in this conflict. I cited the Western politicians, for instance, Western politicians, Ukrainian politicians, who took part in negotiations in Istanbul, and verified all the evidence by using sources, again, different sources, independent sources, and only looking into evidence which will be contrary to kind of vested interests of people who make such statements. So, and I also rely on evidence like videos on social media, like other type of evidence which can be used to corroborate specific claims about strikes and on casualties numbers and so on, which I already mentioned, based on individual numbers of people identified by name who were killed or wounded by both Russian and on Ukrainian and Russian side. So this is kind of example when researchers need to rely on evidence, but often now it became very difficult to do, because immediately if anything goes against the narrative, this immediately leads to kind of charges. This is not, they don't talk about evidence, they don't want to discuss any evidence, like in case of Maidan massacre or in case of casualties and so on. They immediately claim this is like Russian propaganda, disinformation.
Dr. Ivan Katchanovski, thank you so much for your time and for your expertise, and really for your critical work. It's always great having you. Dr. Ivan Katchanovski.
That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.the-ykm.com.